I work with the ROAAr configuration of units at the McGill Library. Today's event is the Many Faces of Norman Bethune. But before we begin, and I pass it over to the panelists and today's speakers, I'm going to just take care of a few logistics. A couple of notes on Zoom. I have enabled live transcripts for today, so there should be, by default, subtitles appearing at the bottom of your screen. You can turn these off if you find them distracting, or you can drag them around your Zoom screen so they're not in the way, but they are enabled just in case they are needed for anyone. You can send a note in the Zoom chat to myself or to my colleague, Michelle McLeod, who is helping on the technical side if you have trouble, or you can email roar.library@McGill for technical support, and also, of course, to send questions for our speakers and panelists. So before we go further, we want to acknowledge that even though we are likely tuning in from home or wherever you are working these days, we are tied to particular places. Let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from. McGill's downtown campus, where I am today, is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. This site has long served as a place for meeting and exchange amongst nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which McGill stands today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Mary Hague-Yearl of the Osler Library here. And that's one of the 4 special collections units at the McGill Library. So Mary, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to jump right in with introducing our first speaker today, who's going to be Seth Kaley. Seth is the Vice President for Gale Primary Sources, which is a Cengage company. He and his global team are responsible for commissioning and creating Gale's award-winning digital archive products, which include 19th century British Library newspapers, 18th century collections online, and China and the modern world. He and his team have worked with many of the world's leading libraries to conserve and digitize special collections and make them more widely available to researchers and students worldwide, including, of course, I'll be talking about working on our Bethune collection here. He's written a number of articles about digital resources and their impact on research and teaching, both for academic journals and also the mainstream press. And he regularly presents at conferences worldwide. And it's my pleasure to invite Seth Kaley to say a few words about the Gale collections generally, and more specifically about the newly published collection of archival materials relating to Norman Bethune.
Great. Thank you, Mary, and welcome everyone to this symposium about Norman Bethune. So I'm just going to speak for 5 minutes, and over the next 5 minutes, I'm going to give you a tour of the digital archive of the Norman Bethune papers. Gale was delighted to work with McGill University to digitize their collection, but I thought I'd start with just a personal recollection of how I first became aware of Norman Bethune. As you can tell by my accent, I'm British, not Canadian. So he wasn't a name that was familiar to me until a trip to Beijing about 4 years ago, when I was touring a campus, and amongst the various statues of local notables, there was a portrait of a Westerner. And I had to ask my hosts who this Westerner was, and they were very surprised I'd never heard of him. They introduced him as Norman Bethune and said, you know, he's a household name in China, and every school child grows up knowing who Norman Bethune is. So that was my first introduction, which was actually led me to the to conversations with McGill University and this eventual digitization project. But why is Norman Bethune a household name in China? Well, it's primarily because of this book that is part of the collection, which is when Norman Bethune died, Chairman Mao himself personally wrote an essay eulogizing Norman Bethune and his contribution to the communist cause, and specifically to the cause of Chinese communism. And every school child in China studies this essay. So here we have it in a bilingual copy. And you can see it starts with Comrade Norman Bethune, a member of the Communist Party of China. Mao talks about the spirit of internationalism that was encapsulated by Bethune. And goes to the point about his utter devotion to others without any thought of self. I mean, effectively, it's hagiography. This is Norman Bethune is almost elevated to this status of sort of communist sainthood. So this is why he holds this status in China that he does. But what about the papers themselves? So at McGill University, as you'll hear, there are numerous collections relating to Norman Bethune, not just the eponymous Norman Bethune collection, but papers relating to the foundation that was set up in Bethune's name, papers donated by biographers of Norman Bethune, and various members involved with either medical exchanges between China and Canada, or those involved in the foundation itself. And so, although we're talking about the Norman Bethune papers here, actually, it's a number of collections about which you'll hear. So what sort of things might you find? Well, the first thing is, although the essay by Chairman Mao is perhaps the most famous piece of writing, there are numbers of other Chinese writers who wrote glowing books and studies about Norman Bethune, which are much less well known in English. But thanks to the work of one of Bethune's biographers, we have translations of these works in the papers. So, for example, there's a piece here that was originally written in Chinese about Bethune and his work helping with the resistance against Japan. And just to give you another example here, here a much more sort of floral work throughout the Green Mountains, loyal bones lie buried. So amongst the papers, you will find much less well-known works than Chairman Mao's essay. And the reason why Chairman Mao wrote that eulogy is he knew Bethune personally. The two men had met. There is photographs of them together, or at least a photograph, and they exchanged letters. So, for example, here is one we can see written by Bethune directly to Chairman Mao. Enclosed is the report he wrote about the hospitals that he had helped set up and run. And subsequently to this letter to Chairman Mao, you can see Bethune's report. There's also photographs. So amongst the papers, you'll find photographs of Bethune himself. Here he is working at a field hospital. And you'll also find pictures of him working in extremely hot weather, typing away perhaps that letter we just saw, who knows. And he remains an iconic figure, as you will hear, to the point that in the 1970s, when Canada normalized relations with communist China, Trudeau Senior, Pierre Trudeau, actually presented Chairman Mao personally with this medal that had been put together, been sculpted by a Toronto sculptress, a part of what we might call Bethune diplomacy. And given sort of current events, perhaps some sort of Bethune diplomacy might be, not a bad thing in the light of current circumstances. These are just a handful of the things I discovered going through the papers myself, and we really look forward to hearing about the other things that people will find as they go through this digital collection. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to listening to the rest of this symposium myself.
Thank you very much, Seth. And now I'm going to move on to the next phase of introductions, which will be introducing the Osler Library itself, since I think that's a participant in our panel discussion, even if a quiet one, and then Brendan Ross and Julian Xue. So the Osler Library is one of the collections that makes up McGill's ROAAr unit, which is rare books, the Osler Library of the History of Medicine, the Visual Arts Collection, and also Archives and Records Management. And we work together with our colleagues because our collections are similar, our audiences are similar, and I think it's a great way of collaborating. And it means we can share knowledge. We might know that the archives have something somewhere on Bethune, and we can talk about it. The Osler itself was formed out of a bequest from Sir William Osler when he died in 1919. He left his library of about 8,000 volumes, which he thought formed the foundation of Western or medicine as he knew it, to McGill, which was his alma mater. And the library opened in the Strathcona Medical Building in 1929. As I said, it opened with 8,000 titles, and we now boast over 100,000. And in those, in terms of Bethune, we have mostly the archival collections are what we'll be talking about today, but we do also have artifacts, both some of the memorabilia that were made in China, to commemorate Bethune, but also Bethune's medical instruments. He had invented or developed a lot of medical instruments. We also have prints in our print collection, and the archival materials cover 6 different archival collections and occupy almost 3 meters of shelf space. So it's not an insignificant collection. In terms of the Osler itself, when I was thinking about how this fits in what we do, I mentioned Osler as being Western medicine, but he also realized that to understand the foundations of our medicine, you had to understand that ideas of transcultural transmission of knowledge. And one of his quotes, he said, "A true student is a citizen of the world, the allegiance of whose soul at any rate is too precious to be restricted to a single country. I care not in what subject he may work, the full knowledge cannot be reached without drawing on supplies from other lands than his own. French, English, German, American, Japanese, Russian, Italian. There must be no discrimination by the loyal student who should willingly draw from any and every resource with an open mind and a stern resolve to render all unto their duties." And so even though we think a lot about a very strong Western tradition, at the library, we're very interested in how communication happens across cultures. And I think it's a very fitting way of moving into our discussion of Norman Bethune, who has this role in Canada and also in China. I think more of the biography of Bethune will come out during our discussion, but just very briefly, he did study medicine at the University of Toronto. He worked in Montreal at a few places, including the Royal Victoria Hospital. Also worked in Detroit, but more famously, he joined the Republican forces in Spain for the Spanish Civil War, and then sort of moved later from there to China, where he died of blood poisoning. And I will leave that mostly to our speakers to discuss, but that brief context. In terms of our speakers, I'll introduce first Brendan Ross. He's a third-year medical student here at McGill. Prior to coming to Montreal, he completed his degree in History and East Asian Studies at Yale University. And then he continued his Mandarin studies at Tsinghua before moving to Changsha, Hunan, for a year to teach high school at Yali Senior High. His research interests include Chinese and Japanese intellectual traditions of medicine and non-Western approaches to medical knowledge. He also, I should mention, won first place in the Del Mastro Family Medical Students Essay Contest for his work called Illustrating the Unimaginable Dissection Scrolls of Edo-era Japan, which is based on a dissection scroll. It's magnificent, which we have here in our collections. And for the Molina Foundation Osler Library Medical Research Scholarship, he worked under the supervision of Dr. Rolando Del Mastro, researching and writing an essay entitled The Chinese Apotheosis of Dr. Norman Bethune, The Making of a Medical Folk Hero. And then our other panelist is Dr. Julian Xue. He is currently the director of the Libera Clinic, a new psychiatry clinic here in Montreal that's also a McGill experiment for teaching residents outside of the hospital. He's a longtime McGillian, having earned his BSc in 2006 and his MD PhD in 2014, and completed his residency in 2019. He has a keen interest in links between Chinese practices of self-cultivation and modern psychotherapy, and notes that he notes the parallels in these forms of human flourishing inform both his research and his daily work. As a medical student, he was a leader of the Medical Students Osler Society, and he also was awarded a first place in the Paman Rolando Del Mastro William Osler Medical Student Essay Contest for his 2014 paper on Sir William Osler's relationship with death. It's a total coincidence that we have 2 essay contest winners here, but we're very pleased to have them. And with that, we will start our Q&A, or not our Q&A, but our moderated question session. I'm going to start with a question which both Brendan and Julian can answer. And that is, when do you first recall hearing about Norman Bethune, and when and how did you become interested in him as an historical figure? They aren't necessarily the same thing. And why don't we start with you first, Brendan, and then Julian, you can jump in.
First, I'd like to say hi to everyone, and I'm so excited to see so many people interested in this event and in Norman Bethune. And also, I want to say a deep thank you to the Osler Library, to Dr. Hague-Yearl, to Gale, and to Dr. Del Maestro for helping advise my project, learning a little bit more about Bethune over this past year. I'm an American who came to McGill as an international student. So I had, like Seth, I did not know who Norman Bethune was growing up. And even actually while I lived in China, I don't think I'd ever had the opportunity to really understand who Norman Bethune was. And then my first year of medical school 2.5 years ago at McGill, I happened to be in the new MUHC, and I literally stumbled upon a large ribbon cutting ceremony for the exhibit for Bethune that they've put in front of the new Royal Victoria. And so I stayed for some speeches about him, and then a light bulb went off my head. I was like, how did I not know about this doctor who had gone to China? And then that next summer, after my first year of medical school, I actually went back to China to do some medical research. And I noticed when I would bring up the name Dr. Bethune, because I was from McGill, it was the easiest way of explaining where I was at medical school. People's eyes would light up and they would immediately get excited because they could recite his obituary, his eulogy that Mao had written. And so I was really curious. This seemed like a very curious situation to me. And then in terms of my own interest in researching him more, I then returned to McGill my second year. And through looking at actually the Osler collection, the extent of memorabilia and propaganda around Bethune is really incredible. There's stamps, there's medals, there's children's picture books, there's every kind of item that could ever memorialize a single person, I think. And there's photographs of statues all over China. And to me, that felt bizarre and confusing. And I wanted to understand, and I had read a biography of Bethune in English, but I never understood how that happened in China. So I started to look more at the Chinese sources. And that led me to this project with the library. And then I'm excited to talk more today. Yeah.
So again, from my side as well, thank you everyone for coming here. I've been more involved in the library in the past. It's such a great honor to be back in one of its activities. So I'm Julian. I was born in China. I came here when I was 7, so I was grade 2. And I wanted to say, it's very hard for people in the West to imagine how popular Bethune is in China. It's hard for you guys to imagine. So as a Chinese person, you can't help but bump into him because he's in our grade 2 textbooks, and in all these sorts of legendary forms that have, Washington and the cherry tree type of stories all through our textbooks, right? And so you can't help but encounter him. And the astonishing thing is, I think I was 12 or 13 when and I've been in Canada for years, before I realized he's not Chinese. It just didn't make sense to me that he was not Chinese. And after we had this discussion with Brendan, I went home and talked about it with my wife, who is fully Chinese. She came to Canada when she was 18, and she was like, she had no idea Bethune was white until she was about in her mid-teens. Right, because the way Bethune is translated in China, Baiqiu, and Bai is actually a common Chinese name. Like we really sinified this guy, right? To the point, and it's hard for you guys to imagine this, but for example, my grandmother is not literate. She doesn't read, even in Chinese. So when the communists started their literacy programs throughout China, they gathered all these little old people from the villages who are totally illiterate and made them memorize 3 texts: How to Serve the People, The Old Man Moves the Mountain, and In Memory of Norman Bethune. These are the 3 common texts that every single Chinese person, as they were going through this literacy program, which is like 95% of China, and they just imprinted this on their memory, right? And my grandmother can recite it. That's the crazy part. And that level of knowledge of Bethune, that's what makes him so widespread. It was even much more during the Cultural Revolution. It's a little bit more dim now, but this is his degree of popularity in China and to the degree to which he's sinified. Exactly.
Thanks for that. Those are both wonderful responses. And I think moving from that side of things, it's appropriate maybe to move closer back to Montreal, to how his peers here remembered him in some ways from before he went overseas. Dr. Maurice McGregor wrote in 1973 to Dr. Meekins of the Royal Victoria Hospital about the idea of maybe honoring Bethune at the hospital with something like a plaque. And I'm going to read a fairly long quote here from one of the documents that's recently been digitized to get a response to that. So Dr. McGregor wrote, I am aware that Dr. Bethune was not the most orthodox or the most liked member of our attending staff. And I imagine that many have a greater claim to fame for their scientific achievement, their teaching ability, or their professional skill. It seems clear that there is no point in commemorating him for his achievements in these areas. Nevertheless, this man is a national hero to the citizens of another country. Indeed, he is probably the only Canadian of whom this can be said. It is probably irrelevant that the nation in question constitutes a quarter of the population of the earth, but that a member of our country and of our profession should have achieved such a level of respect and even veneration in another land is a remarkable fact. I have no strong views on this matter, but wonder whether this is whether his one-time presence in this hospital should not perhaps be noted in a modest plaque somewhere. So I'm wondering what you make of this assessment of Bethune, either Brendan or Julian.
Yeah, I think in reading much more about Bethune and some of the sources in the library, it's so fascinating to see the difference of his reputation in the Chinese sources and the Canadian sources. So he's known for throwing his instruments across the room in the operating room in Montreal. And he also was a proponent of socialized medicine, which I think is something that is not necessarily spoken about as much, but he was also a renegade. I think he was constantly going against the grain of conventional medicine in the early 20th century in Canada. And so I'd say like, he was the last person who cared about his own respectability as professional respectability. He was much more interested in action and pushing society in a certain direction, which I think got him interested in communism, which of course led him to Spain before he even went to China. But I think what's interesting to me really is it almost seems like when he came to China, to the front lines of the fight against Japan with the Chinese Communist forces in the 8th Route Army, this really rough and tough army that was in these rough mountains. It feels like he found his home there because he maybe found people who were likewise driven by revolution, driven by sort of iconoclastic change, rather than driven by trying to maintain a sense of status quo or respectability or following of any rules. They were making up new rules as they went and new ways of fighting. So in some of his letters back home, he actually talks about how he feels like even as he was growing weaker and he was getting exhausted, he wrote about how he felt he belonged in China at the front lines. And even more so, I think what's interesting within the Chinese sources, he talks about how there's writings about how he pushed to go even further than other Chinese doctors. He wanted to really almost like be at the point where bullets were whizzing by his head. And I think that element of it to me is a little bit mysterious. Like what was driving him to put himself almost directly in harm's way? But I think that heroic revolutionary spirit is what really attracted his Chinese peers to memorialize him and remember him. And maybe it took a lot longer for his Canadian colleagues to sort of recognize, well, I guess if over 1 billion people know his name, we might as well have a small plaque back in his office, his former office in Montreal. But it's an interesting contrast. I think Julian can probably add to that as well.
Yeah. So when I started reading about these things, it really shook. Like it's interesting, right? But it was shocking to me how poorly Bethune was known in the West. And it was just like and then when I dug more into the sources, I mean, by that time I was very Westernized, and I know how the West remembers its heroes. The Western historiography, we'll talk about it later, really humanizes its heroes, figure out what they were really like as people. Chinese people don't do that. We have no problem taking a really purely idealistic view of heroes and then putting them in a sort of pantheon, right? So when I first came, seeing that statue on Guy and all of that, and just realizing most people didn't know who this guy was, and I found it very, very mysterious. It made me certainly extremely curious about Bethune. I ended up going to Gravenhurst. I ended up doing this whole thing around him. Gravenhurst was the place in Ontario where Bethune was born, and over there, the curators, the workers there were white from the West, but all the visitors were Chinese, right? So that's the steady stream of that. So for sure, it's fascinating for me at least to know who he is as a human being, and I think we'll talk a bit more about it. I think that's helped. of all the pantheon of Chinese communist heroes, many are not such big deals anymore. Chinese people used to worship this kid, this 12-year-old, no, this, 12-year-old boy who ran up the mountain into a forest fire to fight the forest fire. And he was considered a Chinese hero for sacrificing his life in defense of national property. That's not the modern Chinese ethic anymore. You know, even the Chinese people have really changed from that sort of communist serve, the people at all cost ethic. But Bethune endured. Bethune really endured, and even right into modern China. And it's always been so interesting for me to know why. I think the fact that he is a larger than life character, even in the West. And so once you come to the West and you learn about him as an actual human being, he can continue to hold a tremendous fascination for people. I think that part for me is certainly very, very interesting. Yeah.
Thanks. And I think continuing or moving again, maybe to some of his more local reputation in some of the biographies that have been written about him in the West, and also I think locally in terms of people in Montreal who, he, as a 20th century character, there are still people who knew Bethune or knew people who knew Bethune. He's often portrayed or described as being a womanizer, an alcoholic, a bit of a sort of tyrannical figure in his professional life. And I'm wondering how we should square those sort of uglier aspects of his character with his memorialization, and memorialization both more recently in Canada, but also in China.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Mary. And I think it's important to shed light on Bethune's race and privilege and his chauvinism, and how his position in society in Canada allowed him to pick up and move to China to join the war effort there. This is not something that anyone else other than a white man in his position could have done at that time. I think, though, that it's also important to recognize that the narrative of Bethune that we know today is in many ways a Chinese one, controlled by the Chinese themselves in their own effort to project the strong internationalist movement behind Mao. So in that sense, I feel as though Bethune's legacy is not like some perhaps other white imperialists who go abroad and are trying to save another place. It's more a message of how China adapted and almost took his story as their own. And I think he was in no way imposed. I talked to Julian about this before, but he was in no way imposed upon China as an idea. In fact, it's the opposite, almost, where China took this poor doctor who died on the front lines, who could have been a nobody, and imposed him on Canada, and imposed him on their own people, and imposed him on the world for their own reasons. And so I think it sort of flips around a lot of the typical narratives that we think about in terms of Western and perhaps other parts of the world in an interesting way, and that his fame is really from these non-Western forces. And yeah, I think Julian can probably jump into this too, but it's a really unique story. I can't think of anything like it, really.
Yeah, it's really crazy, right? Because me and Brendan we were discussing this, and I started thinking about the sort of narrative about colonialism and imperialism that we've got, and then you think about Kipling's poem, "The White Man's Burden." What was it that your new cotton sullen people, like half devil, half child? Yeah, these people are like imagining your gods into being, sort of a thing, That he went to China. He brought, I guess, Western culture and stuff like that with him. But like even from his letters, his way of thinking, his style of doing things, Chinese people digested that so well. In a way, much better. He was a much better fit for the Chinese mentality than the Western mentality. Here, he graded everybody in a very odd way, right? He was a revolutionary. He was for socialized medicine, when no doctor was for. Doctors were an extremely conservative force in that entire movement. And then Chinese people have this very different ideal of what people should be. Here, if we find, especially in the 21st century, if we find somebody who's too idealistic, too, or I'm already using the word too idealistic, too passionate, too whatever, like it makes suspicions pop up in our head. Like professionally, I'm a psychiatrist. You wonder about a personality disorder. You wonder about something that's somewhat unbalanced in this person, something incomplete, right? But Chinese people have always had a place culturally for these types of characters. Most of Chinese heroes are such characters, right? Like extraordinarily intense. And Chinese people classically didn't take the microscope to these people's psychologies, to these people's internal lives, and merely honored them for what they did and how. And then, Chinese people always had this idea of a scholar, studying, and then taking everything they've learned and just returning it to the people, sort of a thing. And so in that way, Bethune actually fit the traditional Chinese mythology of what a hero should be. In many ways better than he did the West, just in terms of character and what he did. And so Chinese people just took him and digested him for our own. And I think it's Brendan's essay really shed light on this for me, right? Because he wasn't the only white doctor in China at the time, not remotely. Quite a few were there. Like, this was an international struggle. This was a world war. And he got remembered, one, because, the flippant answer about why he got remembered is like he died. But I think Mao met him, and Mao got his letters, and Mao was like, he's like a perfect fit for what the revolution needs. And Mao's far too smart to let a opportunity like this go away, right? So Mao saw the extraordinary opportunity for propaganda, quote unquote, but really to get the hearts of a lot of people through this opportunity, and then that whole process started. It really, something about Bethune's character, it's a wonderful fit with the Chinese culture that made him to be remembered, right? And I find that such an interesting process, absolutely.
I think a lot of what's coming out here is the idea of how it is that we create stories about people, but also tying that to questions certainly about how we write history about people and the complexities involved in that. So I'm wondering, and maybe Julian, you can continue on this first, and then Brendan, what you think our discussion about Bethune says about historiography generally.
So this is of the greatest interest to me. So the first Chinese history book, reputedly written by Confucius, was Spring and Autumn. And why did Confucius write this book? He didn't write it to record history, not for the annals of time. He wrote it to show that bad kings came to bad ends and good kings came to good ends, and that morality is a driving force in the human world, and that morality is actually the best way of kingship, undoubtedly. In fact, you cannot read Spring and Autumn without a tremendous amount of annotation, because literally Confucius wasn't recording stories. He would write like such and such a person was a bad person, came to such a horrible end in such a year, and then he would just go on. And everything, and it was an annotation that had to fill everything in between, right? And so Confucius, and because he became the saint of modern China, he's like the Jesus of China, period. He was the ruling theory. He set the tone for all of Chinese historiography, right? All of Chinese historiography are moral lessons of one kind or another. Sometimes very, very subtle. Sometimes you had to really scratch to see what the author was meaning. But that was always the exercise. You're supposed to read history and figure out the moral lesson. And if you can't figure it out, work harder at it. It's more subtle than you think, sort of thing. But there is, which is a completely different version of historiography from the West, right? The West really tries to figure out what happened. It's almost an archaeology, textual, archival, and then you try to humanize these people. Be like, you met them in person. Oh, how would they strike you? What would their characters be like? The proper weighing of people in history. I mean, this is a fairly recent. I wrote my own paper about Osler, so I saw the difference between the first biography of Osler written by not Penfield, the great endocrinologist. Escapes me, Mary.
Cushing.
Yes, Cushing. So it's a totally, and then the one written by the guy from the University of Toronto, the recent one.
Bliss.
Yeah, Bliss. So it's two totally different biographies, right? Cushing's biography is very Chinese. It's a hagiography. It's a great hagiography, but there's something about Osler that didn't ring quite down to earth. While Bliss's is much more human, but somehow less inspiring. It doesn't pull me towards becoming a great doctor the way that Cushing's thing does, right? And the whole point why Chinese people bother writing history is to achieve the feeling that Cushing was able to achieve with his. You read that book and you're like, wow, I wish I was a great doctor. a greater doctor than I am. So that's sort of drawing on. And so this part of modernity didn't quite hit China. So we're still doing history in a classical way. We're still writing history in a way that tries to call people out to be better, to be further, which means the weight is not on figuring out who these people are. And so all these legends and myths about Bethune, they continue to live on our textbooks. They continue to live on the Chinese modern imagination without that imperative within even the Chinese academia to figure out who it actually was and deliver it to the mass. But there is a movement in Chinese academia to figure out who Bethune truly was, but to deliver that to the masses as sort of like humanizing and de-idealizing of history, that force doesn't exist in China. And so that to me is a wonderfully interesting contrast. Brendan?
Yeah, I think Julian did an amazing job explaining how historiography exists in a different way in China than it does in North America. And in writing a objective or trying to write a history paper, as I was taught how to write a history paper from undergrad on Norman Bethune using Chinese sources, it was almost like a hilarious challenge, because I remember speaking to Xue, who's actually a writer in Montreal, who's a Bethune expert and wrote a book about Bethune. And I asked him, what sources would you recommend that are objective or factual, but written in Chinese? And he said, Brendan, those don't exist. There aren't any. And I was like, but there has to be. And he's like, that's not how we write about Bethune. And then that just was like a light bulb went off my head. It's interesting seeing in Canada, I think a lot of the articles and biographies about Bethune try to appraise him sort of from his accomplishments and weigh, is he worth remembering? Why has China given him so much memorialization? And I think that interestingly too, I think that historiography actually bled together in some of the biographies I read about Bethune from Canada. So Ted Allen and Sidney Gordon, I think, wrote one of the first biographies, and it was a little bit more of a politically motivated biography. Earlier on in the 60s and 70s, it was popular. And it turned out that most of the Chinese section of Bethune, where he's in China in that book, came from the Chinese source, which is Zhou Fu, who is essentially a propaganda minister in China. So, and there's actual quotes of Zhou Fu saying, I made up all the characters other than Bethune and Mao. And that was then brought over to translated by some I think Chinese scholars, who then gave it over to Ted Allen and Sidney Gordon and thought maybe that this is some kind of source. And I think and I'm not blaming them in any way. I think they thought this is some kind of factual record of Bethune's time in China, when it was really a setting for a picture book, which I also found in the Osler Library.
The picture book is great. It's everywhere in China. It's got these ridiculous paintings of Bethune, right? But absolutely, like you're supposed to read this stuff about Bethune, and you're supposed to want to become a better revolutionary. That was the goal of writing all of these things, right? Norman Bethune, what he actually did was very much of a secondary concern.
Absolutely.
And speaking of the images, I think you were considering sharing some, and I also wondered, I know we want to make sure that we have time. I think we're going to be moving over to Bethune Square shortly, but we also want to make sure there's time for questions. But very briefly, I wonder if you want to share them, and also if you have final, things that you really want to make, points that you want to make sure get out if they might not get out in the Q&A.
Brendan?
Yeah, I can share briefly. So let's see if I go into here. Okay, so I think this is also fitting if people can see my screen. This is in terms of thinking about why and how did Bethune become famous again in Canada. I think this is a political cartoon from the Toronto Star in the early 70s, and it shows a Canadian diplomat leaving, I think maybe the Forbidden City in China, and with a long-term wheat deal in his wheelbarrow, while Australia's diplomat says to USA, the password sounds like Bethune. So I think that even this quote unquote objective appraisal of Bethune in Canada in so many ways, I think, is political, right? And I think we sort of heard that earlier from Seth about this idea, like how do these historical figures return at various points to sort of help push through various political motivations, whether it's Mao trying to receive more support during the Cultural Revolution, or just a few years later when Canada wants to enter the grain market in China, which I think is a sort of funny contrast. And then I think just helpfully to provide some color, these are some of the images of Bethune in the picture book I was discussing earlier. And I get really just, you get the sense that like this Leninist face, but also just like this folk hero, really, like a Johnny Appleseed or a Paul Bunyan character. This is him when he had already cut his finger and he was probably about to die of sepsis, but they show him sort of parting the seas like Moses. And then I think Julian can speak to this last image, which strikes him a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Now, coming back to think of it, other than possibly Lenin, I think Bethune was the first non-Chinese face I've ever met, right? And so you look at these pictures, and when I realized as an adult that this face is not had to be older, was not a Chinese face. So it's actually quite jarring, because the only other faces I've ever seen in this style of drawing are Chinese faces, right? I guess the one last thing I wanted to put out is that I was thinking about it last night, you know? What it must have been like to be around Bethune, or even around Osler, right? Now we could read about the effects Osler had on his students. He really pulled them out into trying to become better doctors. He was an inspirational force, right? I don't doubt that Bethune in China did that for Chinese people. You met Bethune and you wanted to become a better revolutionary, because here's this like white dude from like China doing crazy stuff for his ideals. So in a way, Chinese historiography is factually awful, right? But the emotional force it deals with people, there might be some more truth to that sort of. It's almost like being with Bethune, being called out to this crazy thing that he's been called out to, you know. And then Cushing's Osler as well. There's a more of an emotional force that they're closer to the guy, to his presence, to his emotional presence, rather than his factual actuality, which is something that is interesting that I think about, you know. So I just want to put that out there.
And I want to say a tremendous thanks. Sorry, did you want to add?
Oh no, I was going to say really briefly. I think one final thought that I think there's an idea in Chinese, this word called yuanfen, which yes. I think is something that Julian's saying. And yuanfen is basically just this, it's like a cosmic fate. And I think that earlier on in his life, Bethune had sort of thought he might die in circumstances like this. And I think that the mystery around the fact that he ended up where he did, and that he became this sort of really rare, odd figure throughout history, I think continues to incite a lot of people's curiosity, because it's just so, it's not like a normal historical tale. It's like sort of it's this own like sort of like spark in the wilderness. And I think, so people continue to try to understand it in different generations. Yeah, that's it.
So thank you so much for an incredibly engaging discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Jacquelyn, because I think she has a special treat for us. And then Jacquelyn Sundberg will also be handling the Q&A, and let's continue to our discussion.
Thanks, Mary. Just before we go to open Q&A, I'll give you guys, everyone in the meeting, a chance to share your questions in the chat here, but we're going to just go to one of the ways that Montrealers may have encountered Norman Bethune, and that's through the actual square at the intersection of Guy and de Maisonneuve, where there is a statue of Norman Bethune. So we have our colleague here live from that square, and I'm going to just show this little section.
Hi, my name is Michelle McLeod. I'm the assistant curator at the McGill Visual Arts Collection. I'm here at the corner of de Maisonneuve and Guy Street in downtown Montreal. This is the Norman Bethune Square. As you can see, the sculpture behind me of Bethune himself. This square was inaugurated on this day, March 23rd in 1976. This space was then redesigned in 2008 and continues to be a busy hub of cars, buses, students, Montrealers, and tourists alike. This life-size sculpture of Bethune is made out of white marble and depicts him striding forward, a very common pose for this type of commemorative sculpture. It is raised high on a tall granite plinth that has his life dates inscribed on the bottom. Bethune is shown wearing his military uniform and a surgical gown on top. The gown seems to be billowing open as he strides forward, giving this a more informal look to an otherwise very classical sculpture. His face is stoic and determined as he looks forward.
So thanks, Michelle, for giving us a real-world taste of one of the many faces of Norman Bethune, one that Montrealers might have seen. And we do have a number of questions that have come in. One of them is actually about the iconography of the representations of Norman Bethune that we do see. And one of them actually is in relation to the sandals that he's wearing in this sculpture. And perhaps, Julian, you could speak to this, and Brendan as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what the symbolism of those sandals and possibly the military uniform and jacket as well?
I mean, the uniform is that of the 8th Route Army, and it's very classic. If you watch any Chinese sort of like soap opera show, it's all over the place. It's coming back to fashion too, because Xi Jinping, our current ruler, has this whole back to the basics sort of a thing, right? But the sandals is very interesting. That stuff has had a long symbolism throughout China. It's of the peasants. It comes from the ground. So, for example, and one of our most popular novels, The Romance of Three Kingdoms, the hero of that book, Liu Bei, starts out as a guy who sells sandals. This is the origin story of this great hero, right? So that's always been the thing. And I don't know if the 8th Route Army wore that standardly. I actually don't know. I don't know if they were issued shoes, but for sure, you see a guy wearing those sandals in like any Chinese like movie or a thing, and you're like, okay, that's the hero. This is the guy who's gonna do good things, right? And the antagonist is gonna have his own sort of set of symbols and stuff like that. But that's definitely what with those grass sandals would have represented it to a Chinese person for sure.
Another.
Really
sorry, go ahead, Brendan.
Really briefly, just in terms of the resources I've seen, I think actually there's in the apocryphal Chinese telling of Bethune in China, when he got to Yan'an and he was about to march off into the mountains, I think maybe a peasant soldier said, "Oh, we also try wearing these sandals," and they didn't think he was going to want them. He was wearing some perhaps leather patent boots and patent leather boots, and he's like, "Of course I want to wear your sandals." And it's almost like, I think their way of saying he's one of us, like he's wearing our shoes. And I think that was like explicitly stated in the
I totally forgot that story. That's exactly there. Exactly. That's very well pointed out. I appreciate that, Brendan.
We've had some comments in the chat and come in via email as well about different perspectives on Bethune. And there's a comment here from a Montreal-based doctor who is a chair of orthopedics at the Royal Victoria Hospital in the 1960s. And he says, and I'll quote him here, his comments are, "I was, of course, aware of Bethune's history and a link with the hospital, and there were several books on him that emerged after Canada established diplomatic relations with China." And he continues, "I somewhat naively thought that this individual, Norman Bethune, had a huge impact on the world and that he might be recognized locally in Montreal, something that hadn't happened at the time. The new surgical wing at the RVH had opened a few years earlier, and it contained an unnamed amphitheater. I proposed that it would be called the Norman Bethune Amphitheater. This is when the word naive comes to the fore. At that time, there was still a significant number of active physicians and surgeons at the hospital who had actually worked with Bethune in the 30s.
Oh boy.
To put it mildly," he continues, "they detested him and had no respect for him as a person, a colleague, or most importantly, a doctor." So this is, he goes on to say, he was not a hero in Montreal. And in the end, the amphitheater was named for someone else. But if you want to comment on this very negative Montreal local view of Dr. Bethune.
Sorry, Brendan, you go ahead.
You go.
I could definitely see people whom I've met. I'm like, maybe not, this interaction didn't go so well, but I could see how in another setting they can totally flourish. I think Bethune was definitely one of those characters, right? He was going around the world, the Spanish Civil War, for God's sake, looking for a spiritual home almost, right? And he definitely, because he wasn't finding it here. And how do you know he's not finding it here? Because everybody thought this of him, right? Like, he was going about his own business, and people are like, wow, you're kind of nuts. And then he I mean, surely he must feel this. He doesn't slow down because of it. But then he goes off to do, he goes off looking for his people, and he finds it in China. And what can you say? There's a time and place for people in extraordinary times, you know?
It's interesting. There's another comment on this front in terms of commemoration of him here in Canada concerning a statue on the St. George campus in Toronto that was unveiled by former Governor General of Canada, Adrienne Clarkson. And there was no commemoration of Norman Bethune in Toronto up until that time. This comment comes in from Paul Huang in Toronto. So in Canada, there's this statue, which apparently, as someone has put in the chat, is one of the most visited statues in Canada. And there's a commemorative statue in Toronto. Julian, you also mentioned that the number of visitors in
They're all
Grapehurst
Chinese people, yeah.
were all Chinese people. And it's interesting that the narrative that you were discussing about how this character has been formed by China and imposed upon Canada. Can you comment a little bit about these commemorations that we have in Canada now for this figure?
I mean, the longer, like this stuff, the memory that Chinese people has for Bethune, it looks like the way it's going is going to outlast the local people's distaste for him. This is the direction it's going, right? Which is so ironic to me, because like, again, you know, you grow up, like I grew up, I read Western stuff, Chinese stuff, and then again, back to Kipling's like half-stolen devil child. These children are imagining gods into being, and these gods are being put back in a rewriting of history, right? So at this point, I'm incredibly amused. But time will tell how this will go. It's not clear to me. Brendan?
Yeah, I think that, and thinking back to the last question too, I guess, around how he continues to be memorialized in Canada, I think he grew up as a Presbyterian minister's child, and I think he constantly was pushing against his sort of upbringing. And I think like then when he got to McGill, his advisor, Dr. Archibald, was sort of this formal character. So I think that I'm thinking about the question prior, but that like, I think that he really ultimately like through breaking through and pushing himself out of his comfort zone and moving on to Spain, like he came back and now I think people are starting to realize like perhaps his character is bigger than his role in McGill in Montreal.
Another comment came in on the same topic, just very timely as you were speaking, to the effect that in Bethune's era, it was common for surgeons to throw instruments or be obnoxious with colleagues, abuse nurses, drink too much, and be promiscuous. I mean, this is a perspective, and is it fair to say that the era that he was in, that he was operating in Montreal, was he perhaps influenced by the culture around doctors at his time?
Oh, I don't know, but as a practicing doctor now, I'm so glad this part has changed, right? Like this was not the bright light of medical training across those years, for sure.
A topic or a question for Brendan, perhaps, and for the panel at large. What would you consider to be the best biography of Bethune?
I'm Chinese, so obviously I cannot suggest one. I'm trying to read the Chinese sources, and then you learn very little about the man, though a lot about CCP stuff. Brendan?
I think Roderick and Sharon Stewart's co-biography, I think they have many versions of it, but the most recent one is, I think, referred to as Phoenix, Story of Norman Bethune. And that's just incredibly well researched. And I think it's actually an amazing story too, because Roderick Stewart, I believe, was a high school teacher of history and had his own interest in reading more about Bethune and exploring his resources. Then it became a huge part of his life. And he was brought to China and taught in China for a year, I believe, with his wife. And it's sort of writing that biography also created his own relationship with China. And that book is, I think, really well sourced. It's a great source for exploring other smaller resources on Bethune as well.
Very unusually, Jacquelyn, there was this really interesting question who says, I am not sure about the claim that publicity of Dr. Bethune was simply a result of communist propaganda, you know? I have to agree. I don't think there's something about the man himself, right? Like it's really like the stuff that was created purely out of Chinese propaganda. Lightning, the 12-year-old kid who ran up the fire and then got himself killed. And then Li Feng, another like this Chinese god that was created during the revolution, the Cultural Revolution, out of pure propaganda. These didn't make it into the modern day. Once Chinese ethics changed, once China became much more open up to the market and then the Deng, and a lot of the classical CCP heroes fell into disfavor, Bethune didn't. And I think it's because if you actually start looking more and more at his life, there is a larger than life quality. I mean, there is the unpleasant man, but there's something absolutely fascinating about such a person. And he calls out to something that is very universal in all of us. I mean, maybe not, we're not sitting here, we're not like him, but there's something about his action that resonates, you know, and that definitely contributes to his continued popularity in China, and which is why, to some extent, Canada would acquiesce in having this god imposed back on, right? And so I do think there's something very powerful about the man himself.
There's a comment about thinking about the representations of him from an art historical perspective. Do you think that Canadian representations of Bethune do draw from the Chinese propaganda aesthetics that we saw in the images even that you showed us?
I mean, the statue on that statue on Guy Street, I mean, that could be lifted out of a Chinese storybook, right? The dress, the grim expression, the geometry, the very harsh geometry of his face. There's almost like a Stalinist type of art in there, and it's a Stalinist type of art that Chinese people got from the USSR. So absolutely. Brendan?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was just thinking, it's almost amazingly prescient that Bethune himself, before even going to China, was a painter. And
really?
After he survived this near death, he had tuberculosis, and he had pleaded for a pneumothorax before they were really a common procedure. And then he made this futurist mural, and he also painted a self-portrait of himself, which is very much in line with the eventual propaganda portraits of him decades later. So it's almost like he knew that was the visage that he was meant to inhabit before he even left Canada, which to me is...
No way.
Yeah, and actually there's some information coming out in the chat, and my colleague Michelle discovered this as well, that he did, he held clinics for underserved and underprivileged areas of the city, but he also was instrumental in providing art classes at one point of in his career. So he did have this other side to him as well, which is interesting.
All the comments coming in, I just want to really briefly say it's amazing to see how many people have a connection to Bethune, his family, his presence in Montreal, and it's really special.
And I want to second the thanks for all of the comments in the chat. We don't have time for everything, and we are almost out of time. And there's so many stories in here of interactions or memorialization at the Glen site or places in Ontario as well. So thank you everyone for your questions and comments in the chat. And if possible, we'd like to continue the conversation. You can reach out to us at ROAAr.library at McGill.ca by email if you want to continue the conversation. But for now, I think we are pretty well out of time. Sorry about that. I'm going to pass it over to Nathalie Cooke for a couple of final thank yous and closes, and just a quick thank you to everyone for your comments and questions.
I wanted to echo everyone's comments. The chat has been absolutely fascinating, and what a lively, thoughtful, and candid conversation of Bethune's legacy and reception today. It was really terrific. So thank you to our presenters, to Julian, Brendan, Seth, and also to our moderator, our History of Medicine librarian, Hague-Yearl. It was really a tremendous exchange of ideas, and I really appreciate it. To the ROAAR events team who made today's events possible, quite often working behind the scenes, but to Michelle McLeod, who was helping run things on Zoom today and who you saw in Bethune Square as the roving reporter, and also to Outreach librarian Jacquelyn Sundberg, who ran the Q&A and who was actually the wizard behind organizing these kinds of events. Thanks to all of you for coming. We hope to see you at our next event, which is actually the culmination of our programming for the whole year and is going to happen just the day before we launch a bicentennial celebration of McGill. So I'm going to give you a sneak peek. It's going to be a launch of our own book, which is called Amaze, an A to Z experience. And I suspect you can guess what O is going to represent in this alphabet of our collections. So for O, you will find Osler. And for P, you'll have to come to the launch to see it in its full glory. You'll see a version of our refurbished printing press, because this alphabet book is actually a movable book. So it's part of our programming on Serious Play, and it's quite lovely. So we have some pages that pop and collections that come to life, rather in the way they have been able to do today through the discussions. So hugely appreciated. Next time you go down to Bethune Square in person in Montreal, hopefully as things calm down after COVID, I hope you will remember this discussion, and thanks again. Have a lovely afternoon. Enjoy the weather.